I have a question for you, fellow Albertans. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That's the key question for Albertans as we approach an historic election. And for ordinary Albertans, the answer clearly is no. They're not better off today than they were 4 years ago. Today, I will lay out why Albertans are worse off today than they were 4 years ago and what kind of change we need to get Alberta back to work. I'll show how the NDP has done such deep damage to jobs, our economy, and our way of life. How they've made it tougher for so many families. How their policies have driven up unemployment, bankruptcies, taxes, and debt, while driving down incomes, investment, housing prices, and jobs. The NDP came to office with a lot of promise 4 years ago. Albertans wanted change at the time. They were tired of entitlement, and many voters were willing to take a chance on a new direction. At the beginning, Albertans gave this government the benefit of the doubt, and rightly so. After all, the NDP were new, they inherited some tough challenges, and they meant well. But gradually, what Albertans saw was a government that made decisions based on ideology instead of common sense. A government that thought it could tax, borrow, and regulate its way to prosperity. A government that made a bad situation much worse. It's true that when the NDP came to office, Alberta was in a recession that began with a drop in commodity prices. But they didn't get a basic rule of economic policy. First, do no harm. Instead of trying to help employers who were struggling to keep the lights on, they hit them with a 20% increase in their tax burden on day one. Instead of lowering costs for families that were coping with unemployment and lower paychecks, the NDP raised the cost of everything from home heating to groceries with their carbon tax. Instead of encouraging investors to come to Alberta, the NDP drove them away with the uncertainty of a royalty review, a lawsuit against power producers, massive new red tape and regulations, and making a doomed alliance with Justin Trudeau on pipelines. On top of all of that, they increased WCB payroll taxes. They helped their ally Justin Trudeau raise CPP payroll taxes by $1,600 a year on average families when it's going to be fully implemented. They increased provincial property taxes by $350 million, hitting struggling homeowners and small businesses when they could least afford it. They increased income tax brackets by as much as 50%, driving investment out of our province. They hiked power prices and made a costly shambles of the power purchase agreements, which will cost consumers billions of tax dollars and higher power rates over the decade to come. They raised labor costs on struggling small businesses by 50% in the middle of a recession when people were losing their jobs. They imposed massive layers of new red tape, rules, and regulations. And as I said, they made an alliance with Justin Trudeau that gave him permission to kill Northern Gateway and Energy East, surrender to a U.S. veto on Keystone XL, failed to stand up to obstructionism on Trans Mountain, and to introduce his No More Pipelines Acts, Bill C-48 and C-69. It wasn't too long ago, friends, that the idea of the Alberta Advantage meant this province's competitive edge on tax policy, regulatory policy, and other areas. These deliberate policy choices that Albertans made in the past helped to make us the best place in the country and one of the best places in the world in which to invest and do business. But sadly, it's taken the NDP just 4 years to undo the Alberta Advantage. Its anti-growth policies have changed how business and investors think about our province. Consider that Alberta's ranking in this in the Fraser Institute survey of oil and gas executives on the global investment climate has taken us from the 14th best place in the world in which to invest to the 43rd place. That's not price, folks, that's policy. And look at this map. Alberta is the only province in the entire federation that gets a failing grade from the Federation of Independent Business for its red tape burden. It is increasingly clear that businesses and investors see Alberta as high cost, a high regulation place. This perception is having concrete consequences. But this is not merely a perception, it's a reality. Government policy is imposing huge costs on businesses and investors. A 2018 report by the C.D. Howe Institute, for instance, estimated that total cost per oil well that stemmed from policies like royalties, taxes, and pipeline delays, it concluded that an Alberta oil well faces around $770,000 in policy-induced costs, about twice as much as wells in competing U.S. states like Texas, North Dakota, and Colorado. As the study's author puts it, quotes, "Governments should recognize the cumulative competitiveness cost of their policies." You would think that this advice would be common sense, but that's not a quality that's been in very much supply around the NDP cabinet table in recent years. One of the greatest sources of policy-induced costs is our slow and cumbersome regulatory process. Average timelines for oil wells are now on average more than 4 times longer here in Alberta than they are in neighboring jurisdictions like Saskatchewan and BC and in various U.S. states. It's just one example of how the NDP's agenda has made Alberta less competitive and less attractive to new job-creating investment. As I said, these choices have real consequences. One of the consequences of these anti-growth policies is less growth. Alberta's economy has shrunk, get this, has shrunk by 3% since the NDP came to office. Let me repeat that. When the NDP came to office with so much hope and promise, our provincial GDP, what our economy produced, was $377 billion. But at the end of last year, nearly 4 years later, our economy produced only $347 billion. We have literally gone backwards for 4 years under the NDP. Saskatchewan next door has a similar economy to ours, by the way, similar dependence on commodity prices. They've grown while we've shrunk. These U.S. jurisdictions I'm talking about, as dependent on energy prices, they've grown massively with a boom while we've shrunk and stagnated. Circumstances don't look much better today. The so-called recovery of the NDP is a figment of their imagination. Unemployment has gone up in 6 of the last 8 months. And University of Calgary professor Trevor Toome has recently speculated that we are approaching a second recession. I don't need to tell people in this room about the negative relationship between slow economic growth and falling business investment. It's a negative feedback loop, and we're living it here in the province today. As this slide shows, between the start of 2015 and the end of 2018, investment growth in Alberta has fallen by 45%. Let me repeat that. We've seen business investment cut in half over the past 3 years under the NDP. This is a devastating, job-killing reality. But as bad as it is, it doesn't even tell the full story. Drilling down a bit into the investment data gives us a fuller picture of what's going on. If we remove rising government spending on capital, the situation looks even worse, as this slide shows. Capital investment in oil and gas extraction, for example, has fallen by 61%. Wholesale and retail trade have also experienced a 65% drop in investment. So again, this is not just about one sector. The numbers look bad in virtually every sector, except for government. We're witnessing massive capital flight from Alberta, and with that capital goes jobs. The NDP would have Albertans believe that this trend is outside of its control. It wants people to blame anyone except their government. But here's the problem. It's a hard argument to sustain that when other oil and gas producing jurisdictions are performing so much better. Capital spending on oil and gas in the United States, for example, is now 70% higher than here in Canada. Their oil and gas sector is booming. The opposite is true here. Here's an example. This slide compares drilling rig utilization in Alberta versus Texas between 2014 and last year. So back in 2014, Texas faced similar headwinds to us, same price problems, but its drilling activities are now back to 90% of its 2014 levels. Our industry, by contrast, is still stuck at 40% utilization. The tale of two jurisdictions. Office vacancies in Calgary and Edmonton is another measure of the province's ongoing economic decline under the NDP. Calgary's vacancy rate has actually gone up year over year for the past 3 years and is now north of 25%, as you know. Edmonton's is only slightly better, but it too is going in the wrong direction. The vacancy rate in Edmonton has gone up 70% in the past 3 years. And the housing market isn't faring much better. Last year, Calgary recorded a 14% decline in home sales to its lowest level since the mid-1990s. And that means the life savings of many families, many middle-class families, is being depleted. Many other regions, including Fort McMurray, Lloydminster, northeastern Alberta, and south central Alberta, have all reported sales activity for homes that are more than 18% below the 10-year average. Slow growth and falling business investment have predictably translated into stagnant job growth. Albertans' employment growth over the past 4 years has been an anemic 1.7%, and we now have the highest unemployment in Canada outside the Atlantic region, with 170,000 Albertans looking for work. But again, the top-line number does not tell the full story. Removing the increases in government employment gives us a clearer picture of where things stand. The truth isn't good, as you can see here. Private sector employment has actually shrunk by nearly 3% under the NDP. Let me put this in real numbers for you. We've lost 42,000 net private sector jobs over this time, while adding 62,000 net jobs to the government sector. Folks, in the long run, that's just not sustainable. The province's poor employment record, particularly in the private sector, has harmed younger workers. Many, far too many, are giving up. Alberta's labor force participation rate, that's the number of people who choose to either are looking for work or are working, the participation rate for those aged between 15 and 24 was 69% when the NDP came to office, showing young people in Alberta wanted to work and they could. The national rate was much lower than that. We've since flipped with the rest of Canada. Today, Alberta's rate has fallen to 62%, while the national rate is unchanged. This is a sign that we are letting younger Albertans down. For no one is this more true than young Alberta men. Their employment rates have steadily declined from 67% before the NDP to 55% last fall. This huge drop stands in stark contrast with the Canada-wide experience, which has seen employment rates for young men grow slightly over the same period. But here's why I raise this, and this is really, I think, troubling. The employment rate for young Alberta men is at its lowest level ever in economic history since StatsCan began keeping these numbers in the early 1960s. More generally, we've observed longer and longer durations of employment for those struggling to find work. The average duration before the NDP was 14 weeks, and now under the NDP, the average duration of unemployment is 22 weeks. People are waiting for nearly 6 months to find work. And we're now longer than the average across Canada, which is unprecedented in our country's modern economic history. Falling business investment and job growth have given us a drop in take-home pay. Here is where the costs of the NDP's failure really hits home. As this slide shows, the province's average weekly earnings have grown by less than 1% since the NDP took office. But it's another case where when you separate out the government sector from the rest of the economy, it tells a more troubling story. Public sector wages are up by an average of more than 3%, but private sector wages, which are for the vast majority of Albertans, are down across the board. Let me put these figures into real dollar terms for you. Those working in the oil and gas sector, for example, have lost on average about $61 a week. Those in the utility sectors have lost about $130 a week. Think of these bars as an illustration that monthly provincial payroll overall is down by nearly $2 billion. The upshot is that the average annual, and this is devastating, the average annual take-home income of Albertans fell by 7.3%, or nearly $6,400 for the average Alberta family since the NDP came to office. I can't think of, if there's one reason alone why we need change and this government should be replaced, it's that. This is a huge financial burden that is forcing Albertans to try to get by with less and less. Professor Toom has calculated, based on Stats Canada data released this morning, that compensation for Alberta workers in Alberta is $5 billion less than it would have been had we continued with the same kind of growth trends prior to the disaster of the NDP. The same data out today shows that Albertans' wages and salaries were down again last year in 2018. So much for the NDP's much-hyped recovery. And Professor Toom goes on to say, in a classic economic understatement, he says, "This does not typically happen outside of a recession." Getting by with less has regrettably led to a spike in bankruptcies and insolvencies in our province. This slide shows that bankruptcies are up by more than 1/4 since the NDP took office. And the next slide shows insolvencies have increased by more than 75% under the NDP. The NDP are also accumulating debt at a dizzying pace. It's remarkable when you think about it. Our province was debt-free just 5 years ago, but now we're poised to reach $95 billion in taxpayer-supported debt. Think of it this way. Under the NDP's plan, Alberta's debt will amount to $89,000 for an average family of 4. And if we continue at this pace, the gap between Alberta and high-debt provinces like Ontario and Quebec will soon disappear, and we're already spending more on interest costs on today's debt of $55 billion than we spend to operate 19 of the 23 departments in the government of Alberta. Once that debt takes over, less and less available for schools and hospitals because more and more has to go to bankers and bondholders. What's driving this rising debt? Well, this slide shows us the answer: high and ongoing deficits. This week, Joe Ceci once again confirmed the government has no credible plan to balance the budget. The deficit that began in 2015 will continue unabated under his watch. He tells Albertans to trust him, but we know better. So do the credit rating agencies. They've downgraded the province's creditworthiness 6 times since Mr. Ceci became finance minister. And no wonder. Program spending has climbed by more than 14% since the NDP was elected. Alberta's annual program spending growth has in fact been the highest in Canada for the past 2 years. You think that the province with the largest deficit might think about trying to manage its spending, but no, they're going in the opposite direction. Large-scale spending growth is frankly one of the few areas where the NDP can credibly claim to be leading Canada right now. Alberta's spending per capita is now 14% higher than the average in the rest of Canada. And this is even starker when we compare ourselves to our next-door neighbours in BC. As you know, they have an older population, a bigger province to service, but Alberta spends 20% more per person than BC. Now, I asked you, do you think you're better off today than you were 4 years ago? And the answer was no. Let me ask you this. Do you think we're getting 20% better value than BC taxpayers? I don't think Albertans find that. In fact, they have shorter hospital wait times than we do for 20% less. And still, the NDP has sought to raise taxes to pay for its insatiable spending. What's ironic is that the economic failures that I've been describing stood in the way of their tax hikes. As part of the government's first budget back in 2015, the NDP enacted huge tax increases, which they told us would increase revenues by $6 billion over 3 years. Do you remember that? They were going to soak the rich and make these terrible job creators pay more. But what's actually happened? Instead of $6 billion more in revenues, including personal and corporate income taxes, we are down nearly $8.5 billion lower than the NDP projections over this period. Let us be clear with Albertans about this. The NDP raised the rates on personal and corporate taxes based on a lie. They said they wanted to soak the rich, good old-fashioned socialist politics of resentment, and what has happened? People have moved their income out of this province, capital has fled, and revenues from these tax sources have gone down year after year after year. Less money, not more, available for schools and hospitals and critical public services. Bill Clinton used to say one definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. Well, the NDP, they'll just keep raising taxes, expecting a different outcome. But economic history teaches us differently. The key point here is that Alberta's economic woes are not an accident and are not just the result of global commodity prices. They are in large part the result of the actions and choices of this economically incompetent NDP government. Its harmful policies have led to slow growth, failing business investment, fewer jobs, lower take-home pay, and ultimately more bankruptcies and insolvencies. And we must remember that behind all of these numbers are real people's lives. The NDP promised change, but instead what they gave us is a record of economic failure. The worst economic record of any government in the history of Alberta since the Great Depression. An economy today that is smaller than it was when they came to office. Incomes that are down by $6,500 for average families. The massive flight of capital and jobs, taking what was once the most competitive place in Canada and turned it into one of the least competitive places in Canada. Taken Canada's great job creation engine and turned it into a period of prolonged stagnation and job loss. So I've painted let's be honest, a negative picture here today based on the facts, not opinions, but data. But the truth is, despite all of that, I'm an optimist, and Albertans are optimists. And there's some good news. There's a silver lining around this cloud, and it's this, that these circumstances are not an accident. They are the result of choices. And so they can be fixed by other choices. They can be addressed by real change. But doing so will require bold, decisive action. We will not bring back those lost jobs until we restore investor confidence in our province. The empty office towers around us here in downtown Calgary will not fill themselves. The fire sale of equipment at Ritchie Brothers in Leduc won't stop with government tinkering, more taxes, and red tape. We will not diversify our economy simply by having politicians pick a few winners and losers with our tax dollars. We must unshackle our economy from the uncertainty, the red tape, the endless delays, and the growing tax burden. As I've said before, there's one thing that we Conservatives do hate: unemployment and the corrosive effect that it has on people's lives. A future Conservative government will be obsessed with bringing back investment, diversifying our economy, and creating good jobs. And so we will take immediate steps within days of being sworn in, should we earn a mandate from Albertans, to show Canada and the world that Alberta is open for business again. Now, as you know, we've begun releasing elements of our election platform, which will be a blueprint to build a strong and free Alberta. Today, I'm announcing that at the heart of that platform will be our Alberta Job Creation Plan. It starts with Bill number 1, the Carbon Tax Repeal Act. Come on, this can't be the first event that doesn't get applause. So I know I depressed all of you guys. Here's the good part, okay? You can start applauding now. Bill 2 will be the Open for Business Act that will cut red tape and end job-killing policies. We will liberate job creators by cutting Alberta's red tape burden by at least 1/3 in our first term of government. We will impose legislated timelines to speed up project approvals by government agencies so that they move at the fastest pace in North America. We will restore investor certainty by guaranteeing in law that the royalties in place when a well is permitted will never change. We will stop forcing higher power prices on Albertans by ending uneconomic subsidies for unreliable forms of power. Go ahead. We will launch our Alberta Advantage immigration program to attract brilliant entrepreneurs to innovate and create cutting-edge startup businesses to create jobs here in Alberta. And we will stand up to those blocking our resources and demand a new deal for Alberta to secure pipelines and a fair price for our energy. The centerpiece, I'm pleased to tell you today, the centerpiece of the Alberta Job Creation Plan will be a job creation tax cut on employers to get Albertans back to work. I will be releasing details about this on Monday, but today, let me say this. Alberta had the highest levels of growth, the highest incomes, the highest levels of employment and investment for decades because we created the right economic conditions. We had the lowest tax rates. That was at the heart of the Alberta Advantage. And it's why businesses, small and large, moved here. It's why Imperial Oil and Canadian Pacific moved their headquarters to Calgary in the 1990s, along with thousands of other companies. It's why we ended up with the second largest number of corporate head offices in Canada. It's why so many newcomers came here from across Canada and around the world, doubling our population in the last 4 decades. But what do we see now? More vacant space around us than all of the downtown office real estate that's available in downtown Vancouver. Think about that for a second. In Canada, one of Canada's largest companies has moved the majority of its assets and head office functions from Calgary to the United States. Last week, Devon Energy joined a long and growing list of global companies pulling up stakes and leaving Alberta. It's estimated that some $50 billion of direct foreign investment has moved from this province to lower taxed jurisdictions since the NDP came to office. And every day I meet small business owners who tell me that they're only hanging on. They're only keeping their doors open in the hope that there will be a change of government this spring, and with it change that will turn the economy around. Folks, we cannot continue like this. One of our core advantages was having the lowest tax rate on job creators at 10%. But since the NDP raised that by 20% to punish employers because of their ideology, our business tax rate is now higher than Quebec's, it's higher than Ontario's. We have no advantage over our neighboring provinces of BC and Saskatchewan. But more importantly, we used to have a huge advantage over our southern neighbors with their 35% corporate tax rate. But the world changed last year with the U.S. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now their average combined federal-state tax rate on business is 25% lower than in Alberta. In fact, we have higher taxes on employers than 49 of the 50 U.S. states. The bottom line is this, that business taxes in Alberta, as I say, are higher than in 49 of the 50 U.S. states, and that's before we even get into comparing personal income taxes or the red tape burden. To paraphrase Ross Perot, that giant sucking sound you hear is money and jobs moving from Alberta to the United States. And the world is responding to this new reality. According to Canada's leading tax policy expert, Professor Jack Mintz, quotes, "The IMF expects the reductions in corporate taxes amongst countries will be on the order of about 4 points. Already, France is reducing its tax rate from 33% to 25% by 2022. The Australian government has proposed reducing its rate from 30 to 25. Sweden is cutting its rate further to 20%. Imagine that, socialist Sweden. Canada, with a combined, Jack goes on to say, Canada, with a combined average federal provincial corporate tax rate of close to 27%, now has one of the highest rates amongst the 33 developed countries of the OECD. If companies with U.S. operations plan to shift costs, such as interest expense, to other countries, and to shift tangible and intangible profits to the United States, then Canada is going to end up as one of the biggest victims of base erosion as our corporate tax rate is so high." Unquote. Speaking of Jack Mintz, he's the economist who predicted that the NDP's plan to hike taxes on businesses by 20% would kill jobs and reduce growth. The NDP didn't listen to his warnings or those of other economists. They didn't listen to the employers who actually create jobs in our economy. Why? Because of ideology and politics. Their ideology is informed by the belief that wealth can be redistributed without regard to its creation in the first place. And their politics plays on old class warfare resentments. Now, the NDP will say that reducing the tax rate on job creators will be, quotes, a giveaway to big corporations. So here's the truth. 90% of businesses who pay the so-called corporate income tax in Alberta are actually small and medium-sized operations with less than 50 employees, the kind of mom-and-pop businesses that are the beating heart of our economy. The NDP will claim that our job creation tax cut is, quotes, regressive. But a growing body of economic research says the opposite. As University of Calgary economist Dr. Kenneth McKenzie has written, quotes, "Some recent econometric evidence shows that lower corporate taxes do lead to higher wages and salaries," and quotes, "This suggests that corporate tax cuts may actually be progressive." Professors McKenzie and Fared of U of C have written that higher taxes on business means lower pay for workers. Higher taxes, lower pay; lower taxes, higher pay. They say, quotes, our computations suggest that for every $1 increase in corporate tax revenue due to an increase in provincial corporate tax rate, the associated decrease in aggregate wages ranges from up to, $1.52 for Alberta. Now, I don't expect Joe Ceci to grasp all of this, simply because he's got his mind made up. It's made up by his ideology. But we believe in evidence-based policy, and the evidence tells us that the NDP's reckless increase on taxes on job creators in the middle of the recession decreased wages, decreased growth, and decreased government spending. The NDP will also claim that our job creation tax cut will reduce government revenue. So I've been through this. The truth is that their 20% increase in the business tax rate has resulted in lower revenues for 4 straight years. By contrast, and this is fascinating, by contrast, when Alberta cut its business tax rate from 15.5% to 10% about 15 years ago, tax revenues actually grew by 80%. The NDP will also say that businesses will just hoard these profits and not reinvest in the economy. It's like they learned economics by playing Monopoly or something. But the research is clear. Raising business taxes shrinks the economy, while cutting business taxes grows the economy. The University of Calgary's Dr. Bev Dalby estimates that every extra dollar raised from the corporate income tax costs the economy $3.39. So you raise a buck, an incremental buck in business taxes, but the economy loses $3.40. And that's much higher, by the way, than the marginal cost of raising an extra dollar through personal income tax, which he estimates at about $1.80. In other words, taxing job creators is nearly twice as damaging to the economy as raising personal taxes, but of course the NDP did that too. Dr. Eriget Fared and Dr. Dalby also found that for 1% cut in the business tax rate, that a 1% cut in the business tax rate boosts the economy by as much as 0.2% of gross domestic product. That means jobs, friends. That means higher wages. Now here's a fun one. I'm going through all the NDP predictable attacks, because all they really have left right now, I don't know if you've noticed this, all they've really got left is announcing billions of dollars of new deficit spending at our expense, advertising at the expense of taxpayers to the tune of millions of dollars, and attacking their opposition. So here's the next attack message. They'll have the chutzpah to say that we can't afford to reduce taxes on employers. Really? A government that just made the largest expenditure in Alberta history, nearly $4 billion for a 3-year rail lease to do something that the private sector was already doing, is going to lecture us about fiscal responsibility? A government that wasted $2 billion by breaking contracts with power producers. A government that is spending $200 million on laundry machines because they think only civil servants know how to do hospital laundry. That government is going to tell us that we can't afford to bring investment and jobs back to Alberta with a tax cut that will stimulate growth? Friends, they could not be more wrong. We cannot afford not to take bold action to get Alberta's economy back to work. Either we do so, go ahead. Either we do so, and don't worry, I'm coming to an end here. Either we do so by bringing investment and jobs back to Alberta, or we continue to face economic decline and stagnation as more Albertans lose their jobs, their homes, and their hope. The NDP's choice is to play the politics of resentment and division. But our choice is to act, to grow, to build. That is why we will pass the job creation tax cut and all of these other common sense policies, because we Albertans refuse to preside over the gradual economic decline of our province. We refuse to be the first generation that leaves the next generation worse off than the Alberta that we inherited. And so, if Albertans give us their confidence, we will work every day without relent to get Alberta back to work, to be the best place in North America to live, to work, to start a business, to achieve your potential, to raise a family, an Alberta that is strong and free. Thank you very much.